How to round objects in SelfCAD. Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to review another modification tool, round object, and why it's such a powerful tool and how it could be helpful in editing or creating complex objects. To get started, I'll do something very basic just to explain the concept, and I'll go more deeper. I'll create here a simple beveled shape. So I have here the setting here, and I'm going to make it, let's say 50 by 50, which is a radius of 50, that means a size of 100. And I'm going to add some edges, let's say 16 edges. So this basically looks like a simple cylinder that we create. Let's make it smoother, let's say 32 edges, something like that. Okay. And now I'm going to give the height to 200 to make it look a little nicer. And I'm going to add, so this is basically all you can do with the cylinder. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bevel, but I'm going to add a negative bevel, so -1. And if you see what's happening over here, this would be important because I'm going to explain the same concept using round object soon. What you see over here, the bevel is simply kind of making indentation over here. It adds like a split over here, and it gives it a smaller size over here based on the amount I'm beveling. So I can bevel it like this way, it's be self-intersecting. Actually, this will create a non-manifold shape, but until they start self-intersecting, I can start making it as much as I want. So let's say 1 is fine for now. So the bevel itself is kind of making it shorter, where it smaller over here, or in a positive bevel, it starts getting the opposite way, bigger. And then when it starts, the next thing is the level. So once I add a level of 2, you see actually we no longer have the center that I created over here. It's split into 2, and it's kind of add another segment. And then if I keep on adding segments, as you can see, it starts becoming smoother and smoother and smoother by basically adding additional segments and so on. Now we have the weight, which is kind of just that I can set where the center of the bevel is, and that's not relevant for this, I think, over here. I just want to show this example. Now if you see this shape over here we just created, it's a cylinder that is just indented. It's a beveled cylinder where the faces are beveled. Now if you look at the basic shapes that we have cylinder, but we actually don't have anything that looks like this. Not a cylinder, not a capsule, none of them will actually have the option to create something like this. And the thing here is, if you're coming from Boolean based modeling, that SelfCAD has stitch and scoop, it's very hard to do this because you don't really have a shape to cut out this piece. I mean, you can take a sphere, for example, and position it over here and size it and cut out, but how do you make it rounded, entire thing around? It's really, really difficult to make a shape like this. So if you want to create a shape like this without the shape generator, just a custom shape, and this is a basic use case, so shape generator is good, but in some cases you have a lot more complex shapes that the shape generator cannot handle or whatever. You need to have something that can create these type of stuff. And when we think about it, we think the same way as you see it in the shape generator, where you first think about making the indentation, which you can do simple scaling, and then you think about how to add the smoothness. So to do that, let's move this aside and let's see what we can do with a basic cylinder to show the same concept. So if I go to a basic cylinder over here, I'll do the same thing. I'll give it a height of 200, and I'll give it a radius of 50 by 50, same thing we did over there. And now I have over here, you see the horizontal segments. If I have one, basically there's nothing over here, then I have another segment here added. So basically now I just create the line. So I don't actually have a way of scaling it in the cylinder generator. There's no option to create this, so I'll have to do it manually. So what I'll do now here is I'm going to select all of this, but instead of manually going to picking all of these faces, I'm going to use the advanced selection option, which is loop selection, and I'm going to loop select this entire thing as once. And now you can see over here the size is 100 by 100, which is the same size we had over here, the top in this. And I'm going to simply changing the size, make it to, let's say 75, and the same thing the others, this one 75. So now I have the basic thing the way it looked like in the bevel before adding segments. So this is basically done basic transformations. You just create the split. I use the shape generator to create it, but if you don't have that, you can anytime use the add the details to add a loop. So for example, if you go to add the details, and you can have I want to add an edge, I can see automatic loop finding, and then I can start kind of dragging a loop like this if I want to add loops. So this is kind of another concept like loops, but I'm not explaining now details. I'm not going into details of this. So now this is actually, now we're left to is adding these additional segments, and this is what round objects is doing. So let's go to round objects, and let's take a look first, a basic 2, if you do something 2. Now this is not yet working as expected, so I'll come back in a minute why, but let's first see what this is doing. So I'm rounding it to 1, so let's see what this is doing. It actually adds other segments over here. If I add 1, this means it splits each thing into 1. It's different than this one, than the bevel tool we used in the generator, because it always keeps the original. It's never going to move away the original one. So I had this original loop over here in the center that we scaled down to 75, and then it splits it. It adds another one. So each face gets split into half, and then this splits it into half. If I make 2, then it will split it again. So it means from the original one, I have now this was split over here, and then it's again split over here and split over here. But the reason why this is not looking good is because I have the center over here. So let me first fix it and show you how it should be done, and then I'll explain how it's working. So in order to do over here, I have a few options. First of all, I can take this, and I can basically create an inset. So all I need to do here is to add a segment. So now I've added a split over here, a segment. And now if I go to round objects, let's take a look. It looks much nicer. So it's still not perfect, but it looks much nicer and much more similar to this. Actually, it's more smoother because I've done 2. I think 1 would be enough. So if I do round objects again, let's make it just 1. And now you can see over here, this actually looks quite similar to this one. Okay, so how is this happening, and why did I need to add the split over here? How is this working? So to explain that, I'm going to show you a basic spline, how it's working. And this is basically using the same concept, a simple drawing. So if I go, for example, over here and I draw a, let's say first I draw a simple line. I'm drawing a line here and a line here. Okay, now these are basic lines. I'm going to uncheck it to make a new profile. This is basic lines. And I'm going to take now a spline, which has the options also to check smoothness. I'm going to make it something, let's say 20. Now, if I'm drawing a spline that is straight, and drawing from this point until this point, okay, this is a straight line. Nothing is happening. This is it looks like a line. It looks the same as a line. It's something straight. There's nothing here happening. But if I draw, let's undo this. If I draw a line starting from here to here, the spline is still the same. It's a single line. But if I add the second line over here, suddenly look what happens. The spline gets transformed completely, meaning is not only that it round over here, actually this looks like it became a little shorter over here, but where it rounded is the pieces over here. Everything over here got rounded. And the more you start doing it, so let's say if I start, I'll draw over here, and then maybe I'll connect it over here. You see again, it gets rounded all the way. It got rounded even here also, and the entire shape gets re-rounded as well. And the way this is working is there is a mathematical function that kind of tries to smooth out between curvature. So it takes the existing points. I have a point here, a point here, a point here, and then as you move along, it passes some smooth function to average out between all of them. So that means that it depends on the amount of points that I have. So for example, if I'm going to do the same thing now, the same experiment, but I'm going to add more lines. I'm going to go to 3D Sketch, I take a line, and I'll add, let's say, 3 segments. So if I do the same thing, draw over here, and draw over here, and now I have more segments to work with. And now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a spline, and I'll pass it, click on each point. So I'm clicking here, clicking here, clicking here, clicking here, and the same over here, and over here, and over here, and I'll close it even, go over here. So look what happened over here. Over here, because I had no points, I made a big leap between here to here. It actually rounded over here the entire thing, including the outside over here. Over here that I had points, it didn't touch it, nothing got rounded. It kept it, and over here, that basically was no points. Here was less points over here. It rounded this entire thing. So it kept the shape a lot more intact, hugging the original shape, because it had more points. Now, if you think about round objects, it's a lot more advanced because it's a 3D shape, but it's very similar. So if I'll take a basic cube, for example, because there is no points in between over here, this is kind of like has only points on the corners. If I'm going to round the entire thing, what's going to happen here is, let me show you, it will basically turn it into a sphere because it rounds it from all sides. If I do something like this, look at this. And the more I do it, it turns it in almost to a sphere. Not exactly spherical, it still maintains some sharpness over here, resembles the original shape, but it's almost like a sphere, okay? If I'm going to add resolution to it, okay, so let's say if I'll add simple resolution, and even if I add just a little bit, let's say if I add something like this 2, and now I go to round objects, this is, look how this looks like. Even if I do 4, I mean I could do less, but this is basically what this is doing. It's not going to touch this because it had enough details to keep it intact, but the places where it had more freedom, a little less, or where it was the roundness was a lot more profound, on these things over here, it rounded more. So that's basically the main concept, a similar concept like a spline. Okay, so going back to the previous example, what happened over here, let's show this again. If you think about this one, so once I tried rounding the entire thing, it rounded this corner over here also, the entire thing rounded over here, and in this case this basically affected the entire roundness because it affects the entire object. And the reason it affects the entire object is also because it actually changes everything. It doesn't really change. I said that the initial points will always stay, but it actually gets changed in size because everything gets averaged. So to show you that, if you remember, I sized this for 75, but let's see what's happening after round objects. So I'm taking this shape over here, and let's loop select the same thing that I did before, and let's take a look. So you see over here, this actually got increased in size. The size is now 80.56 by 80.56, when initially this was only 75, because it averages out everything. So all I had to do is add a segment. Okay, so now let me show you another example where this can actually, we have more flexibility. And actually SelfCAD is probably the only software that has this option where you can actually select parts that should be modified and parts not. So I'm taking the same shape over here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to loop select and size it to 75, the exact same thing we did before. But now I'm going to do something different. And okay, so now instead of rounding the entire thing, actually let's first see other options. So first I'm going to loop select over here. What did I do? I'm a polygon, so let's go face selection. So I can loop select this and this, and I'm going to inset over here this one. Inset over here where I'm adding a segment, but on this side, in the bottom side. And I can also add a segment. It will make a difference every time depending where you add the segment, but just to show you that it actually makes a difference, all of them. So I'm going to inset now this one. So now I've added actually segments on both sides. So you have a segment here and a segment here to kind of do it. And now let's do round objects and see how this will be a lot more controlled. So right now this is a lot smoother. Over here it looks actually quite smooth because I kind of added constraint, something like this where it's not rounded, it almost keeps it sharp. Okay, but this is not what I wanted to show. The main thing here, what I want to show here is that SelfCAD has an option that I think no one, or at least not that I'm aware of, has, where you can actually round only parts of an object. And I'm selecting only these faces, and now we're going to go without adding any segment. So you have no segments added over here, and now we're going to go around objects and choose to round only this. And look what's happening now. It rounded basically beautifully only this without adding anything. Now why this is so special is because if you know the way round object is working, this is actually called a subdivision modifier. In Blender or some other software, it's called subdivision. The basic algorithm, what it's doing, it's subdivision. And the reason it's called subdivision because the logic, the way this works is it splits every face. And the reason it needs to do that is what I've talked in many of my videos, is to think about we need to make sure objects stay manifold. Whenever you split an object, a face, you need to make sure they continue connecting to each of the faces. And there's different ways to do it. If you think about the resolution that I've shown before, the resolution tool is using something that's called tessellation. It's a different approach. Actually, advanced resolution has a different option, additional options, a lot of different algorithms how to solve that problem. In a subdivision modifier, what they do is they split every face equally throughout the entire object. And basically, you see all of these faces are split regardless if they're being rounded. Otherwise, they will create non-manifold meshes. But what SelfCAD is doing special is that we split them, but after splitting, we decide which vertices are allowed to be modified, smoothed out through this process or not. So the process is you split them, and while splitting them, you're actually smoothing them out based on the neighboring faces, which creates this round effect. But SelfCAD actually has some logic to determine, to make sure that it only does it for the faces that are selected, despite the fact that the entire object is still being split. So that's basically the concept over here. Now this is actually quite helpful in many cases, even the example I've shown before with a basic cube, where if I don't select anything, entire object, it turns it like into a sphere. But what will happen here is if I select these faces and now I go to round objects, you can see actually it will round only this, and this actually can turn into quite interesting shapes, things that you can do. So yeah, so that's basically the concept over here. Now if you take a basic cube, just to show another idea, if you actually inset the entire shape, this actually can be used around objects to create interesting shapes. So now if I round the entire object, you get something like this. So this actually is something that will be quite difficult to create with other tools. And now I can basically select, you can see these faces here because they are not rounded, so they act like a polygon. So if I turn on my polygon mode, I can select them all. Let me just make sure if I don't have on, yeah, my tolerance is 0. So it's even without polygon, without a tolerance, because this actually is smooth. So I can kind of go and delete this and maybe add thickness to it and add, let's say, -3, something like that. And I can see you can create a shape like this. So yeah, these smooth cutting, which is actually quite difficult with other shapes. So that's basically what round objects is doing. Now, I said before the idea between different tessellation and different way of cutting. So I want to show some examples why this is very important. So if I take a basic cube, and I actually have a few different ways. So first of all, let's go to round objects. So round objects has an option also to turn on linear. If I turn on linear, that means it still cuts it. Like I said before, there's two things involved in round object. It's a tessellation modifier. So it's basically splits every face equally. And I mean every face equally. I'll explain in a minute why that's so important. And the second thing is it rounds it. So if you turn it on linear, this basically means only cut, don't do anything. Now why this is important is because it's sometimes used as a way to get uniform faces, but it's not such a good idea. It's actually better to use the other tool. So let me show you where this could be helpful. So if you go, for example, to resolution, if I do basic resolution, kind of you get something like this. If I turn on uniform resolution, this kind of gets the faces more equally sized. Now in this case they're all equal because it's the same, but what if I do something different? So let's say if I go to the cube modifier and I decide to add segments only in one direction, let's say in this direction, I add segments only here. Now if you go to round objects, it splits everything equally. So what will happen here is it's going to split the entire object. So I made it linear, okay? If I don't make it linear, it will actually round the object, but if I make it linear, look what happened over here. It split it over here, and the more I have to split, for once this to be small faces, look what's happening. This is small, but look how tiny these are becoming. And this is like you know, so destructive. It creates such a heavy mesh that is not needed. But even more than that, it's not uniform. If you're going to use other tools, let's say sculpting, where you need uniform faces, this will be problematic because you have some faces that are bigger, some faces that are smaller, and so on. So what will happen in the same use case if I use resolution? So first of all, the basic resolution will always first reduce everything to 0 and then do it. So if I do something like this, it's actually gonna not uniform. Uniform basically gets it uniform faces. Without uniform, it's actually, you know, evens this out. But what if I make it in such a way that I cannot remove it? So let's say if I go to I bend this, let's go to bending, and in order to make this work, I think I have to switch plane. Let's say I'm gonna bend this and not this direction, sorry, in this direction. So if I turn it something like this, so these faces are all needed. So now if I'll go to resolution, look what's happening over here. It doesn't split anything in this direction, only in this direction. Regardless how big, how detailed I make it, the faces stay kind of uniform a little bit. If I split a little bit, it splits it only where it's needed. If I keep splitting, it splits it over here and over here. But this, it doesn't reduce the details, but it doesn't add additional details either. It keeps it. If I would go to a uniform, I've shown before, it's actually going to keep it uniform. But if I would, kind of keep it as much as uniform as it can, almost equal amount of faces. I mean, equal sizes for each face. But if I go to round object, again, this will kind of make it just way complicated, and these become much smaller. So that's why this is not used for a basic way. It's usually used only for smoothing objects, like the idea what we call round objects, despite the name that it's called SubDivision, it's usually not used as a way of actually just splitting faces, add more details. And usually it's used what we use for resolution, which is a tessellation modifier, or the advanced setting, which is uniform, which is a custom logic that SelfCAD has, which is a lot more advanced to split them. Round objects can also be used for profiles. As with most tools, SelfCAD, they double down for everything. So when you use it for profiles, actually they will look and feel almost the same, but they're actually total different implementations. Has nothing to do with face splitting, it's just smoothing profiles. So if you take, for example, let's say drawing a simple line, let's say something here, oops, I added some extra segments here. So let's say I draw something like this, and if I'm going to round this, there isn't really any face splitting, so it's totally different, but still it can have the same effect of smoothing basically edges. But we use the same tool, it's called round, but it's not a subdivision modifier, it's something totally different. But that's how it works with most SelfCAD tools. Okay, that's it for today. I hope this was helpful, and let me know in the comments if you need me to show anything else. Okay, thank you. Bye.